This year makes 40 years since the release of actually, let me stop right there. I should make something clear before I get too far into this, because I know from the title of the video, some of you might assume that this is going to be one of those videos where some bitter, middle-aged, cishet white dude whines about how all the new Star Trek sucks because it's too woke, and there are too many women, and not enough white men, and the characters show too much emotion, and wah, wah, wah. That's not what this is. First of all, I just turned 42, which makes me pre-middle-aged. Thank you. Second of all, I'm not bitter, and I'm not here to whine about the newer Star Trek shows and movies, and certainly not for those reasons I just stated. Call it woke, call it politically correct, call it liberal, call it progressive, call it socially conscious. Star Trek has been that from the beginning, and if you're only just noticing and objecting to it now, might I suggest going back and watching the old stuff again? Because you seem to have missed a few things about Star Trek, including, like, the whole point of it. For the most part, I have liked the new Star Trek stuff, and for the purposes of this video, I am defining NuTrek as the Star Trek stuff produced starting with the 2009 Star Trek movie directed by J.J. Abrams. The creators of the various NuTrek projects have done a lot of things right, but they haven't been perfect. So, since this year makes 40 years since the release of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, which many fans, including myself, still consider to be the creative high point of the entire franchise, in this video, I'm going to compare Wrath of Khan with NuTrek and examine, in a way that is critical, not hateful or reactionary or grievance-filled, how Wrath of Khan succeeds where NuTrek has sometimes failed, to see what the current Star Trek creators might learn from it as they continue to guide the franchise into the future. One of the things that makes this an interesting and hopefully instructive comparison is that Wrath of Khan and the films and series that make up NuTrek try to do similar things with sometimes very different results. For example, one of the knocks against NuTrek is that it looks backward rather than forward. The new film series that began in 2009 with Star Trek and continued with Star Trek Into Darkness and Star Trek Beyond, and which currently has a fourth installment in development, centers on younger versions of the classic Star Trek characters. Star Trek Discovery and the latest series, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, are both prequels set prior to the period of Star Trek the original series, and so far, every NuTrek production has featured numerous explicit connections and references to past Star Trek projects. Instead of forging ahead into unexplored territory, NuTrek spends most of its time revisiting old favorites in one way or another. That's not an unwarranted criticism. NuTrek does do that a lot. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Wrath of Khan does it too. Lest we forget, that movie is a sequel to the classic Trek episode Space Seed. What's the difference? Well, for me, a lot of it comes down to how these various projects bring in things from past Star Trek productions, and for what purpose. In NuTrek, these sorts of references, connections, or bringing back established characters often play like acts of fan service. We're rebooting classic Trek with new actors, but don't worry, here's the original Spock too. You remember him. We're doing a new series. It takes place 10 years before the original series, and it's got all new characters. But guess what? The lead is Spock's adopted sister. Isn't that neat? You remember Spock. You know what? Screw it. We're just going to have Spock in the show. And Captain Pike. And Number One. And since you liked them so much, they're getting their own series. Pike and Number One and Spock. You haven't forgotten Spock, have you? Spock really is the focal point of NuTrek fan service, isn't he? He's even in the best Lower Decks gag. References to and reprisals of established characters and other elements from older Trek shows done in this way are meant to charm the audience, to win our goodwill by showing us something familiar. Instead of creating something original and taking the risk that we won't connect with it, they roll out something we already feel. connected to, hoping that connection will transfer from the old show onto their new show. It doesn't have to be cheap and lazy and pandering, and there are many examples from NuTrek where it isn't, but it often is. And even when it works, it still creates the impression that the creators would rather remind us of the old stuff than take the trouble to make new stuff. What's different about how Wrath of Khan does it? For starters, consider how little of this kind of fan service there is in Wrath of Khan. Direct callbacks to the original series, winking references to old episodes, Easter eggs. There's not really any of that. It is a sequel to Space Seed. It does feature Ricardo Montalban reprising his role as Khan, but beyond that, the film tells a different story in a different way. Let's look at a few of the differences. In Space Seed, Khan spends almost the entire episode aboard the Enterprise and plots to take control of it. In Wrath of Khan, Khan never sets foot aboard the Enterprise. He takes control of another ship, the Reliant, and uses it to attempt to destroy the Enterprise. In Space Seed, Khan plans to use the Enterprise's advanced technology and weaponry to conquer another planet and set himself up as ruler, a position from which he feels he was wrongfully deposed on Earth in the 20th century. In Wrath of Khan, Khan is motivated almost entirely by revenge. When one of his lieutenants tries to persuade him to forget about Kirk, to take the Reliant and the Genesis device and find a new world for them all, Khan refuses, declaring in a deliciously hammy monologue that he will never give up his quest for vengeance against Kirk. In Space Seed, the conflict ends with a fistfight between Khan and Kirk. In Wrath of Khan, Khan and Kirk are never even in the same room as one another. They communicate only via radio and the view screen. It is 100% a battle of wits. Beyond those broad differences, Wrath of Khan also includes almost no references, direct or indirect, to the events of Space Seed, other than a very general summary of who Khan is and what he did, given by Chekhov to smarten up Captain Tyrrell. Even Kirk doesn't refer to what happened during Space Seed more than a handful of times, and when he does, it's always in a very general sense. There's a man I haven't seen in 15 years who's trying to kill me, and so forth. Our attention as the audience is always being directed to what's happening now. The movie wants us engaged with the present, not remembering the past. The details of what happened in Space Seed aren't even that important to the story of Wrath of Khan. All that really matters is that Khan is an enemy from Kirk's past who has come back for revenge. Like NuTrek Productions, Wrath of Khan uses the previously established Star Trek canon, but it doesn't do so in order to try and buy our affections with nostalgia. Wrath of Khan uses the canon as the foundation upon which to build an exciting new story, a story that stands atop the canon instead of being weighed down by it. One of the most commonly proposed continuity errors in Wrath of Khan is in this scene when Chekhov and Captain Tyrrell first encounter Khan and his crew on the surface of Ceti Alpha 6. Whoops, my bad. This is Ceti Alpha 5. Chekhov gives Captain Tyrrell the quick and dirty summary of Space Seed and who Khan is and how he wound up here. Khan recognizes Chekhov, saying, "I never forget a phase." Just one problem, say the people who think this is a problem. Space Seed was produced during the first season of Star Trek before Chekhov was on the show. How could Chekhov have this kind of knowledge about what happened, and how could Khan remember him if he wasn't even there? Obviously, if you feel it's necessary, you can resolve this apparent continuity error simply by assuming that Chekhov was present aboard the Enterprise during the events of Space Seed. We just hadn't seen him yet. For all I know, someone brought this up during the scripting of the film, and that was the explanation offered. But that's not really important. What is important is the creators of Wrath of Khan didn't write a scene where Chekhov and Khan recognize each other because they got something wrong. They wrote it that way because they decided it was best for the story they were telling to have Chekhov in that role, not just for this scene, but for everything in the rest of the movie that happens to Chekhov as a result of this scene. And they didn't let the fact that Chekhov and Khan never actually interacted on screen before that stop them. Wrath of Khan acknowledges the Trek canon, Wrath of Khan uses the Trek canon, but Wrath of Khan isn't shackled by the Trek canon. The creators of Wrath of Khan, and I'm mostly referring to director Nicholas Meyer and executive producer and co-writer Harve Bennett, treat Star Trek as what it is, a work of fiction, not holy scripture. They know their job is first and foremost to tell a good story, not to act as priests interpreting a sacred text or historians reconstructing actual events. One of the things that makes Wrath of Khan a good story is the way its plot is driven by and acts to develop and showcase its characters. This isn't just some random adventure of the Starship Enterprise we get to watch. It means something to the people involved, particularly to Kirk, the lead protagonist. There are a few lessons to be taken from Kirk's character arc in the film and how it's structured and presented that I think the creators of NuTrek would be wise to take to heart. Besides its tendencies to resort to shallow fan service and get tangled up in established canon, another aspect of NuTrek that fans and critics have often criticized is its over-reliance on trauma as a means of character development. One of the most recent examples of this, and arguably the most flagrant, is the depiction of Jean-Luc Picard in Season 2 of Star Trek Picard. Throughout Season 2, we learn about Picard's hitherto unexplored traumatic childhood. His mother, it seems, lived with a severe mental illness that eventually led to her committing suicide in the family home. Jean-Luc, just a child at the time, blamed himself for his mother's death, and the series positions this guilt as a major motivation for Picard's career in Starfleet, reframing a life of exploration and adventure as a prolonged act of self-inflicted penance. Now, let me make something clear here. There's nothing necessarily wrong with writers incorporating trauma into their characters. Traumatic backstories are very common among adventure heroes. Superman's entire planet blew up. Batman's parents were killed. Spider-Man's Uncle Ben was killed by a burglar. Spidey could have stopped, but didn't. Magneto is a Holocaust survivor. It'd take way less time to list the superheroes who don't have traumatic backstories, actually. They're nothing new to Star Trek either. On TOS, it's revealed that Captain Kirk is a survivor of an Earth colony that was struck first by a famine and then by an act of genocide ordered by the leader of the colony, who thought the famine would be easier to deal with if there were only half as many colonists. Smart thinking, Governor Thanos. On TNG, Worf was orphaned as a young child during a Romulan attack on a Klingon colony, and Tasha Yar has one of the most gratuitously bleak backstories of anyone in the franchise. On DS9, Captain Sisko's wife Jennifer was killed by the Borg, and Major Kira is a survivor of the long and brutal Cardassian occupation of Bajor. On Voyager, 7 of 9 was abducted by the Borg as a child. So none of the NuTrek creators introduced the concept of traumatic backstories into Star Trek, and there's nothing wrong with using trauma to develop characters as a rule, but there are ways of using it that are better than others. If you use it too much, it gets repetitive, and if you use it the wrong way, it can have the effect of flattening your characters rather than adding depth and complexity. Now then, let's look at how the creators of Wrath of Khan handle Kirk's character arc in that film. For starters, no traumatic backstory. Like I said a minute ago, if you watched Star Trek the original series, specifically the episode The Conscience of the King, you know that Kirk does have at least one incredibly traumatic event in his personal history, but it doesn't figure into the story of Wrath of Khan at all. Kirk's past does come back to haunt him in Wrath of Khan, however, not his past trauma, but his past choices. Those past choices are embodied in the film by two characters, Khan and David Marcus. Khan represents Kirk's overconfidence, his conviction that he can solve any problem, that there is no such thing as a no-win scenario. As Khan himself says to Captain Tyrrell in his first big scene, Kirk marooned Khan and his crew on Ceti Alpha 5 and then never returned to check up on them. He treated it as a solved problem, not an ongoing situation to be managed, and the results, when Khan escapes Ceti Alpha 5, are disastrous for Kirk and those close to him. David, Kirk's son with Dr. Carol Marcus, represents the road not taken. He reminds Kirk of the life he could have had, the person he could have been, had he not been so committed to, as Carol puts it, chasing through the universe as a member of Starfleet. It's the most high-stakes midlife crisis ever, basically. A midlife crisis being something I know nothing about, because, as I mentioned at the top of the video, I only just turned 42. In Wrath of Khan, we see Kirk haunted by past mistakes and regrets, not by trauma. But there's another key difference between the character arc of Kirk in Wrath of Khan and that of Picard in the second season of Star Trek Picard. Kirk's regrets and mistakes are not presented as defining him or explaining him. Kirk certainly suffers as a result of his decision to leave Khan on Ceti Alpha 5 and never return, but it's not a shoe Kirk has spent the intervening years waiting to drop. Quite the opposite. In fact, Kirk doesn't seem to have given Khan or Ceti Alpha 5 a second thought, which is part of the point. He considered it a closed case. By the same token, Kirk seems sorry that he wasn't in David's life as a father, that he and Carol weren't together all this time, but the film doesn't use that regret as an explanation of Kirk's character. His lack of a long-term romantic relationship isn't presented as a result of Carol's absence. His single-minded commitment to being a starship captain isn't framed as him running away from his responsibilities as a father. The story isn't about Kirk struggling to process past trauma that he's never dealt with. It's about Kirk dealing with urgent, present-day consequences of decisions he doesn't seem to have thought much about since he made them until now. The past is backstory that acts as a foundation for the plot and provides Kirk with a starting point for his character arc. It's not used as a key to unlock the mystery of James T. Kirk, the way the creators of Star Trek Picard use or attempt to use Picard's childhood experiences with his mother. In Wrath of Khan, Nicholas Meyer, Harve Bennett, and the other creators, including the cast, particularly William Shatner, who gives a career-best performance, use established elements to tell a new story. With the exception of those basic established elements and the minimal backstory necessary to establish context, it's all new stuff. They don't contrive the plot to include gratuitous appearances by established characters or Easter eggs linked to fan-favorite moments from the original series. They don't take unnecessary detours to relive some of the greatest hits, which admittedly were far less numerous in 1982 than they are today. The temptation wasn't nearly as strong, but then, as now, it was still better to resist it. This focus on what's happening rather than what happened applies to Kirk's character arc as well. Kirk's story in Wrath of Khan isn't about who he's been, but who he is. His arc is defined by how he is changed and what he comes to realize about himself as a result of the events of the film. All of this is not to say that NuTrek has never done it this way. I just wish the creators of the various NuTrek shows and films would do it this way more often. And do it the other way, not do it the other way. For example, while I have enjoyed all three of the films set in the Kelvin timeline, I don't think it's a coincidence that the best of those three, Star Trek Beyond, is the one that most closely aligns with the storytelling principles I've been describing that are exemplified by Wrath of Khan. Other than the basic previously established elements, the characters, the ship, the general setting, Star Trek Beyond tells a wholly original story. It's not a retelling of a classic Trek episode. It's not full of clever winking references to elements from older Star Trek shows or inversions of those elements. It has no cameo from the original Spock. That wasn't an option anyway, since sadly Leonard Nimoy had died by the time the film went into production. Instead, It uses the memory of the original Spock as an important part of this Spock's arc in the film. Initially considering leaving Starfleet, Spock ultimately decides to remain on the Enterprise, having had his bonds with his crewmates strengthened by their adventure. The rightfulness of his place among the Enterprise crew is reinforced by this scene, where Spock is sorting through Spock Prime's belongings and finds a photograph of the original Enterprise crew together. That shot of that photograph of the classic Trek cast, a promotional still from Star Trek V, I believe, is one of the most explicit references to a previous Star Trek production in any NuTrek film or TV episode, but it works because it's rooted in story. It's not there to tickle our nostalgia bone, not primarily anyway. It's there because it's meaningful to Spock in this moment, in this story. The ways of interacting with established canon and the use of trauma in characterization are not the only problems that have occasionally kept NuTrek from being all that it might be, but they are the major problems that can be addressed by following Wrath of Khan's example. The biggest issue, for me anyway, of the currently in production live-action series has been the often abysmal pacing of the season-long story arcs, but there's not much to learn from Wrath of Khan as far as that goes, except perhaps, if you have enough story for a 2-hour movie, don't try to stretch it into a 10-hour series. The most important lesson Wrath of Khan has to teach the current creators of Star Trek is this: no matter when a given show is set, whether it's a prequel or a sequel or whatever, no matter how many legacy characters it might include among its cast, the best way forward for Star Trek is to tell new stories focused on that show's here and now. Make the characters the protagonists of their own adventures, not tour guides through the canon. Make shows and movies that add to the canon rather than obsessively reviewing and reprising it over and over. So far, the latest NuTrek production, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, has been doing just that. Even though it's a prequel set in the years before Star Trek the original series, and even though its cast is filled with legacy characters, including younger versions of TOS regulars Spock and Uhura, and recurring TOS characters Nurse Chapel and Dr. Mbenga, plus, of course, Captain Pike and Number One, who originated in the unaired first pilot of TOS, The Cage, Strange New Worlds has focused on story and character, rather than backstory and fan service. There are quite a few characters with past trauma, or knowledge of future trauma in Pike's case, but like I said, that's nothing unusual for Star Trek, and to date, their traumatic backstories have remained just that, backstories, not inescapable, ever-present experiences that comprehensively define them as people. Strange New Worlds is off to the best start of any NuTrek series. We're only 4 episodes into the first season as of this recording, but hopefully this trend will continue. Who knows? If we're lucky, Pike's midlife crisis could turn out to be just as entertaining and unforgettable as Kirk's, which would be great for me, because then I would have another role model to turn to. You know, if I ever have a midlife crisis in the future.